Then, October the 15th, 1650, came to the Great and General Court in Boston a book you can tell by its cover. They didn't bother to read it, they just read the title. That's all they had to do. And they voted that on October 16th, they voted to protest the book and its ideas, and they voted to condemn the said book to be burned in the marketplace at Boston by the common executioner. The marketplace would be where now the old State House is, and the centerpiece of the village. This was to be done on Thursday, which was a lecture day, and so there would have been a lot of people. It was market day. It was intentional. And I think that Thomas Bell, the executioner, took one copy of the book and dropped it into the flames. They did not round up copies. In fact, Roger Williams wrote just about a week later saying, "I understand there's this book that came over from Mr. Pynchon, in which there's some derogation of Christ in it, and it was burnt," he spelled it B-U-R-N-T, in the marketplace. And he wrote to John Winthrop Jr., basically, "If you find a copy, could you send it to me?" So it was burned by the executioner. Notice that. That is to be humiliating. It's as if you're executing someone. You could be if he would be willing to do it, said the protestation. If he agrees, and I think he probably did because there was pay in it, but so the book was condemned. Now, what did it say and what was going on? I will go through this as clearly as I can, but I have to say it's not easy in one sense, because it is, as David Hall points out, a fairly abstruse point of doctrine. We're not talking about something big here. But the first claim that Pynchon made was that Christ did not suffer hell torments to redeem humankind. He did not do that, because God would never make Christ suffer. God wouldn't do that. And secondarily, that Christ did not bear our sins by God's imputation. That there is no way, he said, to credit or reassign to another person guilt. There's no way to credit or reassign to another person merit, favor. Everybody gets only what is theirs. So far as Christian doctrine of the atonement, where God suffers, where Christ suffers at the behest of God, in some ways of stating that, he denied that could be possible, and he did not seem to understand that anybody would ever do the time if they did not do the crime. At least he wouldn't have it that way in his court. So he was enlarging upon his theories of justice and applying them theologically. And he thought, this is a great solution. It will be a big help and a big step forward for theology. I'm sure he had that in mind. And the third one, and the last one doesn't matter so much for our purposes or anybody's purposes, but what Christ did do, he says, as he obeyed. That's what he did. No suffering, that's not the point. Yes, he suffered, but humans did that to him. God had nothing to do with it. But he obeyed. And I'm thinking that for the man who runs Springfield, obedience is probably a pretty important virtue. So in some senses, the whole book is a tract, I say, on obedience. He's big on obedience, because that's what makes his community work. So, I don't expect that we can talk about if anyone has questions about this, but I don't know how to get too much clearer on this complexity than that. Samuel Eliot Morison wrote about Pynchon, and 30, 40 pages on this well-done article years ago in which he gives about a paragraph to this. It flummoxes everybody. Part of the problem that Pynchon had was he was not educated at the university. He did not have background for this. He was plunging in from his own part of the world. He liked the writings of Hugh Broughton, who was an English scholar at the time. Hugh Broughton was a great Hebrew scholar and was very big on the old languages, all of them, but especially Hebrew, Chaldean, Akkadian, and the like. But he also had this interesting twist. This is a picture from one of his books which shows Babylon the Great from the Revelation materials. He was a little bit strange in some respects in terms of his own topics and idiosyncratic. In fact, he was so unique that the King James Bible did not welcome his proposals. He was not allowed to work on it. He couldn't work with other people. But Pynchon, at somewhat of a distance, found this very exciting. So that is a source for what Pynchon has. And most of his points have a source somewhere else. He did come back to the court in 1651. In May, 6 months later, they met in May and in October. He came to the May meeting and acknowledged that he had written the book, and he met with 3 clergy to talk about that. They discussed this, and he wrote this letter, which said, in effect, well, he's mumbling here a little. He's saying, yes, there may be other things involved in what I wrote. Yeah, I'll go with that. And the court was happy, but they were not fooled. They wanted more specifics. So Pynchon, probably then or somewhat after that, decided time's up. I think instead of trying to go by what people want me to do here, I'll just go home, back to England. So here is the response from John Norton. He actually handed Pynchon in that May meeting this manuscript. Pynchon had it to study and work on over the next few years. He wrote the discussion. It's called A Discussion of That Great Point in Divinity, the Sufferings of Christ. This is totally in response to William Pynchon. And the Commonwealth paid for this. They hired him to do it. At this time, sometime in 1651 or early 1652, Pynchon returned to England, boat here showing us going back. And he did not go to Chelmsford. He did not go back to his original home. I began to wonder why not. He would have relatives there. Seems like a good idea. Until I found out that Chelmsford was very strongly independent. Chelmsford had been where the Wat Tyler Rebellion in the 1400s ended, when the king hanged the people on Primrose Hill in Chelmsford. So they're feisty folks up there. Now, Pynchon had come out of that, but he was kind of a squire now. And so this picture, which I'm looking forward to show when I talk about this in Chelmsford, this picture is of a bonfire in Chelmsford, theoretically, when the House of Commons voted down the episcopacy system for the Church of England. They said, no, we're not going to have bishops anymore. They actually did. They voted that. But the reason you never heard about that is the House of Lords would never agree, because the House of Lords would rather deal with 12 bishops than 100 committees. So that was the what shall I say, radicalized environment in his hometown. So he chose another place, and he went to Wraysbury, which is right near Windsor Castle. And this is the property as it is. That is the building, and the only picture I've ever been able to find of it. It doesn't exist. It was burned, and it is underwater actually now. The area is right across from Runnymede, where in another time a king was humbled, and we're celebrating the anniversary of that this year, yes, of the Runnymede. How many years is, however many, 12, 10, whatever, when King John had to give in to the nobles. It's right across the river, right across the Thames from Wraysbury. In fact, there are people in Wraysbury that think this really happened in their town, their side of the river. So Pynchon, in his retirement, came out with some more books. This book about the Jews' synagogue is really not about any synagogue, but about a church. It's about how the church should be organized. Independency or together, and he has kind of a solution to that. He'd written this in Springfield, I'm pretty sure, because there's slight references to it in the Meritorious Prize. And he came out with another book on the Sabbath, which said it's very important to know when Sabbath begins and when it ends, and most people have got it wrong. But I will tell you, and he has very complicated solutions to that. This book also he wrote in Springfield before he returned home. And John Norton's book was 1653. 2 years later, Pynchon comes out with his own answer to Norton, and he borrowed Norton's idea of putting in some of the opponent's text and then putting in his response to it. So he did the same thing. It's the same story all over again, the same theology, nothing changes. He just writes a lot more. This is 2-3 times the size. You see, you have the book, I think. I'm not sure you have the next one I have.
You have the Meritorious Prize.
You don't have this one. You also have the next one I'm going to show you, and the final one. And by you, I mean the Springfield History Museum, right across the way. This book has a misleading title, and so often it looks like the original big book, important book. No. It has another title that I much prefer, A Farther Discussion, which they put different title pages on it. Same text, just a different title page. So it's let's talk a little more. You have a discussion, a farther discussion. And that's where Pynchon is. And he's just stuck on this. He's reading new books. He's got a lot of new armaments for his argument, but it comes to the same thing. And then there is his last book, The Covenant of Nature, made with Adam, and it's on the same story. And he gets increasingly hostile toward Norton. He says, I don't know why he hasn't written. He should write back. I've written something to him. Well, Norton wasn't being paid anymore to write for the Commonwealth, so he didn't write any response. I would like to just simply point out that the top of this has, in Pynchon's handwriting, for Reverend Mr. William Reeve. He spells it R-E-V-E, but usually it's R-E-E-V-E-S, from the author. It's his own autograph, if you will, and that copy is in the Brown Library. And this book is even bigger than the last one. They get bigger and bigger. It's repetitive. There are sections where he does it again. There's one place where he says, I know I've said this before, but I'd like to say it again. And we start to wonder what's going on with Mr. Pynchon. I think this is just my impression that if you sat down with him, I can see in that drab, the Wraysbury house was supposed to be small rooms and not very conveniently placed. And I can picture this rather dark chamber sitting with Mr. Pynchon opposite the fireplace. He would probably drone on a lot about things. And I don't think you could get a word in edgewise. And he wouldn't like to be corrected on anything. He wrote about one person who wrote to him here, William Gattaker. He had written to Gattaker, and Gattaker wrote back and disagreed politely with Pynchon. And Pynchon tells about this. He says, at one point, one correspondence made me rethink it a little bit. And I thought I might be wrong, but then I decided I wasn't. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he says. And in 1662, late 1662, William Pynchon died and was buried. The book you just saw was dedicated to the pastor of this church at this time, the Puritan minister of the Racebury Church. And he was buried in this cemetery. It is unknown where, because the kinds of stone which they use in that part of England are very soft and they disintegrate too easily. So there's no marker, no indication. But I'll leave with this final, and I tend to write this in books if I sign one for you. It seems to be a nice thought. Your ever assured faithful friend, William Pynchon. That's his handwriting. I do have one more slide just for you. Sometimes people say, you know, how long have you been interested in this? Okay. I don't know. I found the book in my uncle's attic, and I decided, I'd seen a picture, and I decided, okay. My sister-in-law is an artist, and she said, you could use that for the cover of your book. She was joking.